welcome to the Questioning Behaviour podcast. We are your hosts, Sarah Merle, and today we're going to be questioning some behaviours.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the dummy that don't.
And today we're actually going to be talking about the behavioural science of teaching, and actually not just teaching in general, but more specifically teaching within universities. And even more specific than that, teaching within universities on behavioural science courses. So, Mala, are you a good teacher?
Am I a good teacher? Sometimes. Are you a good teacher?
Yeah, it depends. That's normally the message in behavioural science, right? It depends.
It's very context dependent. For me, the context is whether my students actually want to learn or don't want to learn. Because I don't really, quote unquote, waste effort on those that don't want to learn. But if you do want to learn, I am here for you. I will support you no matter what. Even if you don't actually know what you're talking about, if you show me motivation and passion, I will support you the whole way through.
I love it. It's like some real ruthless love, you know? You know what you're getting.
I'm a tough love teacher. But in all fairness, from my student evaluations, I've never had bad reviews. So I can't be that bad.
Okay, well, this is kind of interesting. You know, the whole idea of the only way that we're evaluating good teaching is student reviews. I mean, you say you've never had a bad review, but is that the best way that we should be evaluating teaching? I think the jury's still out on that.
I feel like it kind of depends. So at the start of my so I massively influence my reviews because at the start when I start teaching, if it's just me teaching, I'm not like helping out in a group. I give I call them kids, and I warn them in advance that I call them kids or kiddos throughout, so they don't get offended.
Bear in mind, they're only like 3 or 4 years younger than both Mella and I.
You know, sometimes a bit more. I mean, I'm already at the ripe age of 24, and some of them, can be 17, 18. So that's an 8-year difference-ish. No, that's a 7-year difference max, because I apparently can't do mathematics. To get back to the point, I warned them in advance that first of all, I'm gonna call them kids or kiddos, and I don't mean them any disrespect. I tend to curse a lot. I don't mean any disrespect by that either. If they have an issue with that, they can always come to me and I will try my very best to rein it in. If they have an issue with me in general, with the material that I'm teaching, the way I'm teaching it, with me as a person, for reasons beyond me, they can also come to me and let me know. If that's too scary, they can also email me and let me know.
Yeah, I imagine it would be quite scary.
Yeah, I suppose it would be. And I also tell them, just in general, that I have a certain way I teach. I'm quite old school. Like I said, I don't do this pedagogical rigmarole where I'm just like, I'm here to make like teaching like super engaging for you and like super fun and whatever. Like, I'm sorry, but that's not why I'm here.
That's a terrible impression of me, by the way.
That is not an impression of you. It's an impression in general. But it's not like I warn them, like, I am here to teach you this material. Like, we're gonna go through this together. If you have any questions, I'm here for you. But if you are here and you don't want to be here, you don't have to be here for me. So I feel like I'm quite stern. I'm stern but really supportive.
Yeah.
Which is my favorite type of teacher. So I'm just emulating that. I'm really not original.
Well, I mean, I think I wouldn't mind being taught by you. At least you know what you're getting. Like, very clear expectations of, this is who I am, this is my expectations of you, this is how you're going to get the most out of my classes. Like,
yeah, exactly. But that's also why my reviews are never bad, because you know exactly what you signed up for. And like, if you don't want to be there, just don't show up.
Yeah,
and that's fine to me. So like, the kids who might really have hated me won't show up, and as such they can't complain in the reviews because they've never seen me teach. See, this is clever. This is strategic.
It is strategic. I mean, right, let me tell you, and you haven't asked, but I'm going to tell you what my problem is with student evaluations. Okay? This is my soapbox, right? You see, I'm putting it down.
I'm getting ready.
Okay, so teaching evaluations. So, number one, they are normally the only way that departments get feedback about how well you are doing as a teacher. And as we know, only having one measure is not going to give you the best estimate, right? You need multiple measures, right, to crowd out the noise. Secondly, they're very easily manipulated, right?
True.
So it is incentivized for teachers essentially to advertise the teaching evaluations at the end of the class. And basically you can be in the room with people and say, look, you're evaluating me and this is going to affect my career performance, and pressure people into giving you a good review.
Oh, really? Ours are done online. I've never been in the same room as people evaluating me. I'm just like, oh yeah, this shit's online. You're probably gonna get an email. See ya. Like, I've never put much pressure on it. I just can't be asked.
Well, so they're online, but you are encouraged in your last lesson to actively get people on their phones to log in and do it, because that's when you have the highest response rate, right? It's like, rather than saying on your own time, if you remember, please do it. It's sort of saying, okay, we have 10 minutes before we start the class. Everyone get out your phones and complete the teaching evaluation. Like, that's how we're taught to do it. Yeah, it's...
Completely went over my head. Went over my head. I'm a terrible teacher. I don't even know the basics.
Well, there you go. So you can take some tips from me.
Thanks.
Thirdly, so I'm still going, I'm sorry.
Yeah, no, keep at it. Mm-hmm.
Thirdly, what you get in teaching evaluations is a lot of personal opinion, which on one hand, yes, you do want to have student voices heard and they matter. And, it's the student's experience of the teacher and the teaching that can be really informative. But also, because they are opinion and subjective, that you also get a lot of, bias, whether that's gender bias, which there have been lots of studies to show that female teachers get worse reviews than their male counterparts, everything else held constant. The type of language that are used to review female and male teachers, very different and very gendered. So yeah.
I love how you're like, it's a very gendered reviews. You're just, trying to point out the difference between a male being assertive and a female being called a bitch. Which, by the way, I have to add, I have absolutely no issue with being called a bitch as long as you, pass the fucking class. So stop complaining and do your work.
Yeah, well, that's like one aspect. And then there's also things about sexualizing your teachers and inappropriate comments and comments about what teachers are wearing, and how much makeup they're wearing, blah, blah, blah. We've seen it all.
I find this actually quite funny because I've always gotten compliments, very non-sexualized, but compliments by both my teachers and my, quote-unquote kiddos about the fact that I wear quite a lot of makeup. Like, if I wear, like, a bright-ass eyeshadow look, like, people are very nice about it, which is nice. I think that's nice.
I love that for you because, hey, it takes a lot of skill to make your eyes look as beautiful as they do.
Aw, you charmer.
Was that a backhanded compliment? I'm not sure. I meant it as a full compliment.
Oh, I don't think that was backhanded. I'm choosing to take it as a full compliment. Anyway, back to the soapbox.
Yes, sorry. I mean, I could probably go on, but I am aware that we are in a position where we actually are going to be interviewing someone in a bit, and that's probably going to take up the bulk of the episode, but
it should.
It should do, unless I carry on. But all in all, if I could just sum it up, I think that it's not really good enough that the universities are only seeing student evaluations as a form of getting feedback on teachers and using that to determine who gets a promotion and who gets more money, right? It's a measure that is actually being used to have an impact over people's lives, and yeah, it's not good enough. So step it up, teachers and teaching evaluators. That's all I've got to say.
All right. Well, actually, it's I love the tangent and the complete rant that you've just gone on, but we're now going to talk to, so the interview of today is Bruce Rigal, who's a very, very close friend of mine because we did the masters together. And then he moved on, so after the masters, he moved on to actually now be the head of a business school in London. So that's pretty epic. It's a slight change of environments, slight change of pace. But I have to warn that I don't think we're actually going to be talking about student evaluations, but we're just going to be talking about the behavioral science of teaching. But I'm excited for it. So take it away, Bruce. So today we're actually talking to a really, really good friend of mine with whom I did the master's together. But now I'm stuck in doing a PhD, but he has actually moved on to greater things. So I'm obviously talking about my friend Bruce. So Bruce, please introduce yourself. Who are you and what do you do?
I'm Bruce, and I was, as Merle said, a classmate of hers at Warwick University. And I now run the Business and Law School at St. Mary's University in Twickenham in West London. And I teach behavioral economics and research methods.
Fantastic.
So normally we ask people, how did you get into behavioral science or behavioral economics? But given the fact that we did the same masters and now you're actually teaching behavioral economics, this seems quite clear. But what happened before? What made you decide to do the masters?
Well, that's interesting. So I studied a course called Risky Decision Making in 1988 at the University of Chicago's Booth School of Business. And it was taught by a woman named Elke Weber, who you guys both might recognize. She's now one of the leading neuroscientists, an area that didn't exist. And basically, we were being taught at Chicago's the neoclassical view of the world. And there was no room for non-rational expectations, views of things. And here was this lady teaching something completely different, saying that psychology was involved in decision-making. And I loved it. I loved the course. We had a really good time. We did a really interesting research project in Las Vegas around gambling, which we could discuss if we have time. And then I went the normal route of Chicago MBAs and went to Wall Street and then came to London and the City of London and threw away all that psychology stuff. You know, I was a rational banker who was going to do derivative models and make accurate decisions. But as I got further and further up into management, I realized that there was a lot more to decision making than just figuring out all the parameters and putting it into a mini-max spreadsheet and making a decision, that there was a lot of human stuff involved. And I thought, I want to be a behavioral scientist. So I read some books and studied and looked at my old paper with Elke Weber all those years ago. And then I figured out, and this is kind of my philosophy a little bit, I figured out that wasn't enough. You know, as you said, Merle, you know, just reading a couple of popular textbooks and pontificating isn't real learning. So I thought, if I really want to understand this subject, I should go back to university. And that's how I then, you know, here was my decision-making process. I said, which universities are relatively close to London and my home, because I have a family. And there was 2 or 3 programs in a sort of couple of hour radius from my house, and Warwick looked like the best one. And now, of course, I'm sure it is the best one.
Naturally.
Not biased at all.
Having only tested the one, that's the best one.
Okay, yeah. Sample size is a bit small, but yeah, I've heard good things.
From me, predominantly, which is also completely biased.
So you went to Warwick Business School to learn a bit more about behavioral science, and now you're teaching behavioral science and behavioral economics, is that right?
Yes. Well, there was this. So when I finished, I didn't know what I was going to do with all this new knowledge. I was planning to go out and do some consulting on my own, or helping my young colleagues who were starting up their own businesses in their businesses, thinking maybe, although they were better at the mathematics and the difficult experimental stuff in behavioral, that maybe they'd need a gray-haired, experienced person to help them set up their companies and governance and things. So that was one thought. And then I got a phone call from a friend a woman named Ruth Kelly, who used to be the Labour Minister of Education in Tony Blair's government, and she's one of the vice chancellors at St. Mary's. And she said, "How would you like to come run a business school?" And I hadn't really thought about that. You know, that was sort of a bit of a jump.
Such a random offer. Can you just imagine someone calling you up and be like, "Do you want to run a business school?" And I'm like, Now that you mentioned.
To be fair, she had asked me 3 years earlier to interview there to be the chief operating officer, which is something I'd done at Deutsche Bank for a long time. I'd been a chief operating officer. So our introduction was that, and I'd said no because I'm going to Warwick and I want to do the studying. And then she came back and said, you have, and I saw this as a way of putting in, being able to teach behavioral economics, but also being able to put some of the things that we learned at Warwick, Merle, into practice in a management situation.
And have you managed bringing behavioral science to both management and teaching? Have you made Warwick proud?
Boy, that's a high standard to live up to.
Oh, questionable.
It's like, I think it's like, to be honest, I don't know. It's like all behavioral science. You all these heuristics and biases that we learn about, we're very good at picturing them in other people. So Am I a good critic of my teaching colleagues? Yes. Am I a good critic of the management of St. Mary's? Yes. Am I good at criticizing my students on their behavioral economics papers and things? Yes. But am I actually myself dealing with my own biases and heuristics? I question whether I'm doing that. Of course, one of the ways to deal with it, as you know, Merle, one of the ways to deal with it is to ask my classmates like you to come into my class and watch me teach.
So for context for the audience, I actually have sat in on some of Bruce's now online lectures and I've given him a long list of critiques, which he hasn't forgiven me for yet.
And I'm putting some of them in place.
This is true. This is true.
So Bruce, let me put this to you. I don't know whether this is a bit of an unfair question, but what's the difference between a good teacher and a bad teacher of behavioral science?
Ooh.
That's a very good question. I mean, I'm not sure behavioral science is different than other subjects, maybe in that matter. My traditional approach to learning growing up, I've spent I have an undergraduate degree in business and then a graduate degree in business, and then I helped at universities. I've taken courses in different places, and the traditional method for me of learning has always been really smart person stands at the front of the class and gives me their great knowledge, mostly which is research-based knowledge, either because they've been in their jobs for a long time or because they're a great researcher or both. That's if you can imagine me sitting in a room 30 years ago, you were Chicago, there were finance teachers who went on to win Nobel Prizes who sat with a piece of chalk and wrote on the board for 2.5 hours straight, and we wrote everything down that he wrote and then asked him questions and he asked us questions. That was the whole we were junior and he was senior, and he and we were interested enough to do that. That's not necessarily good teaching. I mean, the thing that first of all, it is good teaching if you're self-motivated, if you're really interested in the subject, if you have the background, if you have the prerequisites to show up there, including a reasonable level of intelligence and background and ambition. But if you're a semi-motivated student, like a lot of our students are, and I'm sure like the three of us would be on some days too.
Depends on the course.
Yeah, you need to engage the students. And I think one of the, and both of you know this stuff, but here's one of the big findings of behavioral science is that learning from experience is very different from learning from description.
Yes.
Which is why I think we can't see the biases in ourselves. We have to go do it. Yep. So I would say really good behavioral teaching is not making, there's a bad word because that sounds directive, but is learning with the students through cases, through trial and error.
Sure.
So the classic, just think of a simple first year behavioral sciences course. The classic games of the public goods game and the dictator game and the ultimatum game, I explained to my students at St. Mary's, and their eyes glazed over. When I showed it to them with a good video, they showed a bit more interest with the music. When I actually got them to play the public goods game, they just perked up.
Okay, so this is what they need. Direct interaction, don't watch it, just do it. Fair enough.
Yeah, learning from experience. And I gave them we used chocolates as the currency for the public goods game.
I'm signing up for this class already. I will be there next time.
What was interesting is some of the students didn't even take the chocolates with them when they left. They said, I've got enough chocolate, I'll take one or two. But they still played the game wanting to win the chocolates. There's an interesting behavioral
Yeah, well, maybe
question.
sometimes it's not the prize. Sometimes it's just the feeling of winning. That's all you really need
Yeah.
as an external motivator. For me, it works as
Yeah.
well. For Sarah, it works even better because Sarah is dead competitive.
Yes, yes, I am. I'm not ashamed to say. I was just gonna say that's really interesting. So it's engagement, but also engagement through gamification as well. Would you say? Is there sort of a role of sort of trying to make learning fun? I guess would be the underlying message as well. In that is that sort of part of it? Do you think?
I think it's making it fun and making it that you're actually doing what you're saying rather than talking about doing what you're saying. So, if you took a leadership class, I don't teach leadership, but if I was doing a leadership class today, I think I'd appoint leaders in a group and ask them to lead a group in something rather than saying, here's the great 5 things that Churchill and Gandhi and Nelson Mandela did to be great leaders.
Sure.
I'm thinking back to some of our teachers, Merle, both methods were used. I'd say Nick Chater uses a stand in front of the room and be really smart and teach his stuff, but he does it in such an engaging, friendly way. He makes it interesting, but he does it sort of old style.
Yeah.
Whereas Elliot Ludwig made us read the papers, do presentations on the papers, made us sort of delve in more. And both I thought were very good.
I'm interested, Bruce, in your opinion on this. I mean, if we think about sort of models of attention scarcity, students only have a certain amount of capacity to really be paying attention to new information that's being taught in lectures. And sort of the models of sort of lectures, taken on by university are to do this sort of 1 hour, 2 hour, 3 hour sessions. I mean, in your experience, is there like an optimal length of a lecture? I know it depends, but if you had it your way, how long would your lectures be?
Wow. I think, again, I'm almost automatically going back into my experience and sampling from my experience, and what my experience is going to be what I think is best. So when I was young and at university, and I think an hour is not long enough. Mm-hmm. Sure, it's true that you cannot concentrate for a full hour. You can't concentrate for a full hour the whole time. But then again, if your if you're going to spend the time to physically move to a classroom or cut out some time out of your day, doing it in 15-minute slots isn't going to work.
Sure.
It's like watching a TV series. If you need the few minutes at the beginning to remind you of where you are in the plot series, and to remind you of what happened last time. Mm-hmm. And if it's 15 minutes, you're never going to get there. So I think something like an hour and a half, or maybe even longer, so that you say the student and the lecturer say, this is the time we're putting aside a serious chunk of time for a serious subject to engage in on the subject. What's much more important is how do you break up the time? So right. And you probably shouldn't stand and speak for more than 5 or 7 minutes. That's where I think the trick would be.
That's very short.
Well, without asking the audience a question, or without doing a breakout, or without showing a video, or without getting them to vote on their phones for something. It's
you bring out the technology. You bring out the phone. Is that a good idea? I mean, once I have a phone in my hands, I'm not putting it down anymore.
So there was a study done last year in the UK that showed that UK students that more than 25%. In fact, we know that people love accuracy, so I'll say 27% because it sounds like it's more believable. If I say exactly 27.2% of students are so addicted to their phone that they feel anxiety when it's not beside them. Yep. And I started my teaching thinking, I'm going to tell these students, you check your phones at the door. But most of my colleagues don't do that. There's not a university-wide policy for doing that. Even if they put them in their purses or their pockets, they almost automatically, system one, suddenly have their phones in their hands, which is what I do too. So I think integrating the phone into the classroom is probably a better idea than just standing up and cracking a whip saying you can't bring your phones.
Yeah, no, I remember I had a university lecturer actually who made it his policy that he was like, I do not want to see any electronic devices in my lecture. And he would ask people to stay behind if he saw them checking their phones. It was a bit draconian. I don't know. It almost felt like he didn't really trust us. And I just didn't really, respect him. It was kind of a bit controlling and a bit like paternalistic. But I do think it's interesting because there is this, debate whether or not the phone is a distraction, or whether or not it can be incorporated into the teaching. Is that possible? But it sounds like you yourself use quite a lot of technology or try to use technology as a sort of way to engage your students. What sort of technology have you used that you think is really good?
I haven't. I could tell a better story than the facts. I haven't used actually that much. I think using videos is really good. Okay. I can to get last week I explained the Kahneman-Tversky taxi cab problem on Bayesian statistics, yes. Which I don't know, Merle and Sarah, if you guys have done that on the show, but that's a difficult concept, and there's some really good videos out there of people explaining how it's done with pictures and music and visual taxi cabs driving around. And why should I be better placed to explain that than that video? So I think videos are really good with discussion before and afterwards and breakout groups and things like that. I love the voting ones which I have not used, but I've used as a student, where someone will say, what are the words that, when you think of St. Mary's University, what are the words that come to your mind? And then the screen makes larger the words that are repeated the most. It sort of randomizes all the words that the audience views, but the words that are being said more often are more salient by being bigger. And I think that's just a good visual way to get people, and it gives feedback to the students, right? One student might say, oh, I'm the only one who came up with that idea. Aren't I great? And someone else might think, oh, I think like my friends. We all think that this is the most important thing. So that kind of thing I think is really good.
So you're really engaged with what I would argue is really quite interactive teaching. But what am I supposed to do if I have to teach 400 students at once?
Then I think you have to do a 1 hour lecture.
That's long enough then.
Yeah, I think it probably is. We're talking a lot at university about, particularly with COVID and being locked down, of having all of our lectures taped and then having seminars in person. So you try to produce a reasonably interesting lecture on a tape. Everybody goes, 400 people, 500 people watch it, and then you get together in small groups where you can discuss it.
I see.
But you can't realistically teach 400 students.
True.
And a lot of the theory of learning, which, by the way, I'm studying for my PG certificate at St. Mary's. In part, that's my teaching certificate for a number of reasons. One, because it's transferable. It would allow me to teach in schools. Also, I'm sort of required to do it, but interestingly, they put it in my contract that I had to do it. And then the minute I signed up for it, all the senior people around me said, why are you doing that?
Interesting.
So, tell you one thing and do another. And it's not very behaviorally informed, unfortunately.
Okay.
The sort of the theory of education in this country that's being taught. But it does talk a lot about learning together as opposed to teaching. So our job is not to teach our students. Our job is for our students to learn. And if you take that perspective, your ego it's not about how entertaining your lectures are. The question is, are the students learning the material? So if you give them assignments at home and if you make them work in groups and you're not up there being the great orator, but they're learning the material, isn't the goal for them to learn the material? Mm. It's not for the teacher to be a great actor.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, so I guess that sort of moves the goalposts a little bit to what the aim of being a teacher is. I know we have to have exams, some sort of standardized form of measuring how well people have, taken in information and learned, the material. But what do you think about written exams? Do you think that there's too much emphasis placed on memorization and sort of this form of assessment? I guess I'm talking about sort of an idyllic world. In your ideal world, how would you assess your students' learning?
Well, so the theory is, and again, we're learning this in my class, is that you need to have all sorts of different assessment measures because that will allow, we're all unique and some people will perform better in a presentation, other people will perform better making a poster, other people will perform better with a blog or an essay, and others in an exam. Mm-hmm. And if you do a whole mixture, you get a better result. I think there's some truth to that. Now, again, you're asking an old person, and an old person can build up a lot of biases in their life. I was pretty good at writing exams and not as good at writing papers. Mm-hmm. I like exams. I like and I don't mind the regurgitating memorized mnemonics. The way I teach behavioral corporate finance last week, mm-hmm. I use a book by Hersh Sheffrin called Introduction to Behavioral Corporate Finance. And he lists 4 heuristics, 4 biases, and 2 framing effects. Oh. Now, Merle put up a chart in our class that had hundreds, right?
So too many. It's too many.
It's too many. And I don't really care if Hersh's are the right 10. But on the exam, I said, what are the 10 biases, heuristics, and framing effects that Hersh Sheffrin talks about in his book? And give me an example of each.
Oh, nice.
And they will either have regurgitated that, or because it was open book because of COVID, they probably would have looked it up in the book. But at least it gives them a framework to remember. And you memorize, memorizing stuff is good. Mm. It helps you build a framework. Yeah. Just one more point is, interestingly, when I did the behavioral economics exam, which Merle, you remember, wasn't that easy from Andrea and Graham.
I actually thought that exam was really, really easy because I only picked the mathematical and game theory based questions. So yeah. I was just writing my calculations, which game theory I did in my undergrad, and a lot of microeconomics I did in my undergrad as well. So it all looked familiar, and I think I was done with that exam in half the time, and I had a great time.
Show off.
I thought it was a nice exam. Yeah. I genuinely enjoyed that exam, okay? It is what it is.
So I walked in. It was a 3-hour exam in a huge room with hundreds of students. True. And I was the oldest by about 25 years. And I sat down at the table, and for the first 10 minutes I thought, what the hell am I doing here? This is so stupid. I could walk out of here and it won't make a damn difference to my life. Why am I doing this to myself? Then I looked at the questions. I looked at the mathematical questions that Merle aced, and I thought, I think I can do these. But if I make a mistake, one little slip up will drop me from 80 to 60. So I did the written questions, and I'd memorized a whole bunch of mnemonics to help me with the written questions. And unlike when I was 21, I couldn't remember what I remembered the mnemonic, but not what it meant.
Oh.
So memory but I think either way, I think the action of actually having studied a set of materials is good. Now, essays are great too, right? And in the UK, much more than in North America, there's sort of this belief that going to university is learning to write an essay and referencing correctly with Harvard style or APA or whatever your choice is. In North America, people just don't do that. Unless you're studying arts, in business, you have to write very few papers. You don't have to reference them properly. So that's an interesting, and I think I wish I'd learned to do it the way it was done here. So I think developing your own ideas and essays, presentations are great, right? Presentations, particularly in business, what happens in the real world? What even in the academic world?
Yes.
How do you get hired? You get hired by
how you
sitting
yourself
in front of a panel and doing a 10-minute presentation of what you believe and then answering questions.
Yeah, true.
That's another aim of, I guess, university education. It's not just, giving students the knowledge, but also a skill set that's going to be applicable, for their life after university, outside of academia. Do you think that, I mean, it is strange to think that, all of us three sitting here having a conversation now, we've all, reached a relatively high level of education. And partly is that just because our brains are more wired to be better at doing these sort of sit and written exams? What sort of, learners are at a disadvantage in the current system, do you think?
Oh, I've got you. How much longer do we have for this discussion? I think, of course, I've met Merle's parents. Sarah, I haven't met your parents, but a lot of what we do and what we think we should be doing in education is we learn from our parents, and not just from what they told us, but from what they did. I went to university because my parents went to university, and then the Tony Blair's government came along and said we need to increase the number of people going to universities, and the percentage of students in the UK, I think, since the war has gone up, the Second World War. I know with young people, I always have to say which war. From the 1940s or 50s, the percentage of young people going to higher education is probably 5 times at least higher. It's now over 50%, and it used to be 10% for an elite few. And that's good in one way, but it's a problem in another because they have no context. A student who comes to St. Mary's, who's the first in their family. Now, if they were a great high school student, and that's why they came to us, because for 10 years they've been improving every year. Maybe their parents were hardworking immigrants who didn't have the chance to have education. But if they're the children of people who haven't had that educational background and they haven't had a great school experience, it's very difficult to teach them to do a paper in a logical style that's not an opinion piece, that's actually a analytical academic piece of work, correctly structured and correctly referenced. The three of us have probably had experience with that kind of thinking since we were 3 years old. And some of my students today at university have never had that kind of thinking. Not, the hierarchical kind of, you have a main idea, you have 4 or 5 sub-ideas underneath it in each stage.
Yeah. No, I think you're absolutely right. I think to get back to Sarah's original question, I do think that people who aren't very good at just endlessly regurgitating information, or people who aren't very good at writing in some sectors of academia, are gonna have issues going through an undergraduate or a postgraduate, because it is so much examination. And it's just, like you said, Bruce, it's just memorizing mnemonics and then hoping by the time the exam comes around that you still memorize everything that you thought you'd learned. But I have to admit that although I'm very good at memorizing things like that, most of the times after this exam, like a week later, I wouldn't be able to tell you much more about it. It's just completely left my mind. Whereas if I write papers, I'm still able to remember what I've actually studied. So that there's something interesting going on there as well. So in that case, are you teaching people anything, or are you teaching them to pass exams? Which is another question.
I think you're right. There's also, though, discipline, right, that's necessary, right? So you need to, the act of sitting down and taking a bunch of behavioral economics material and memorizing what mind space means, and then memorizing what were the three things, the three, I'm not going to, in neuroeconomics, there was three things.
Algorithmic,
the analytical level,
computational, yes. Algorithmic, and the implementational.
It was, but that's not the letter. But I think it's a P or a T. But it doesn't.
You might be proving your own point here by not being able to remember this.
Well, I'm proving that Merle, but the act of being disciplined in your processing and your thinking will help you afterwards. And I think a lot of students need to be able to categorize things and make a structured argument. You know, even if you're learning your colors, right? You can learn colors randomly, or you could teach. And I'm going to sound like a terrible parent here, and I didn't do this. But you could teach a kid the range of colors between infrared and ultraviolet. You know, the colors of the rainbow in order. Mm-hmm. And there's something about learning that order that trains your mind to be logical. You know, why have you put it in that order? Because of the following. Whereas, you know, if a pet peeve of mine in an essay is someone will list, they'll say the 7 things that are important when deciding on brand loyalty are, and then they'll list 7 things. If they don't list them in alphabetical order, I want to know what the ordering is they listed them in, because it's and that's ridiculous, but we need order to be able to learn, in a sense. So I think even the regurgitation learning is good. And I'm not talking about top of the line students like the two of you.
Oh, stop it.
A lot of times, come on. Absolutely. To get someone who doesn't know how to write in English properly, in sentences and grammar, to write a decent business email so that when they go into their first job, they will be able to get stuff done through communicating with their colleagues, takes some discipline. It takes learning to when you use IT apostrophe S and when you use ITS for its.
Sure.
Yeah, I think that's really interesting. And it's sort of learning the order and having this sort of methodology, I guess that's really important for your own personal learning process, which is, I guess, why that's an important part of your teaching. I think that's something that I find quite interesting, that, you know, if you become conscious of, you know, how you yourself learn, that's going to have some influence over how you teach your students, right? Yes. It's some sort of, you know, you can be unconscious about it, and it just being this sort of bias. And I find myself doing this, you know, for me personally, I need to understand why in order for me to be able to move on to the next point. Like I need to understand why are we using a Cobb-Douglas function? You know, you're telling me that it's Cobb-Douglas, and you want me to just move on and accept. Okay, but why? Like, what's so special about this? Why do I need to learn its name? So for me, when I'm teaching my students, I always become a little bit meta about it. You know, when I say, look, we're using Cobb-Douglas. This is how you recognize a Cobb-Douglas function. And I go a bit extra and say, if you see this pattern repeated, you know that it's a Cobb-Douglas, and here are the properties, and this is why you will see this throughout your undergraduate in economics. Because for me, that makes my brain click, And then I can start pulling concepts together and, okay, I've seen that before. And I really prioritize that in my teaching. And I'm just starting to realize now in our conversation that actually, just because that works for me doesn't mean it's going to work for anyone in my class.
Would have been completely wasted on me. I don't know what it is, but underlying mechanisms, I couldn't care less. But I'm a very different learner. Sarah and I teach and learn very differently, which probably because we learn very differently is the reason we teach very differently. So
maybe why you're friends too.
It's possible. It's possible.
That's interesting.
I think I'm more like Merle, and the why was, I had to just sit down. The why was I need to get through this course and do really well because that's going to get me to the next stage and then the next stage and then eventually I'll get a job. It was kind of utilitarian. Yeah. But all the research shows that Sarah's right.
Yeah.
I don't know. Sorry, that's unfair. Who knows?
Wow, what a statement.
When someone says all the research shows, it probably means they don't know anything. Aww. Simon Sinek, who you either will love or hate, wrote the famous book Start With Why.
Yeah.
And why, why captures people's hearts? And in the end, you're trying to capture people's hearts, not their minds, right? That's the one lesson is you want to engage the whole person. You're not just trying to convince them that you're right. That doesn't get you anywhere. Yeah. So I think starting with why is a really, really good idea. And then when you learn it, you understand what it's just another hierarchy that you can place it in. Why is the rainbow multicolored? Okay, I know why. Then I can figure out what the colors are, right? I mean, if you really understand the different wavelengths. Yeah, I'd do it Merle's way. If the teacher said, memorize the colors of the rainbow, I'd learn the song. Isn't there red and yellow, blah, 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 right? Which are probably in the correct order. And that's just an easier way.
This is the thing. It sounds like the way Bruce and I are approaching this. Like it sounds almost kind of ignorant and kind of stupid. And like once we see it written down, or once we have an authority figure, like a teacher telling us this is what a rainbow looks like, deal with it. But the thing is, within education, at least in the current state that it is, I haven't had many teachers explain any type of why to me, because in the majority of time they are already rushing through the material, where after a lecture, which very often, so I am not a lecture type person. I don't like listening to people for hours and hours and hours. It's not my type of learning style. I can't do it. And then after a lecture, which I find very, very draining, I'd have to go home and sit in complete silence and go through all the material, preferably reading, myself, because the lectures never made any sense. And by that stage, if someone is asking me why, once I'm 7 hours deep into reading, I think I stop caring about the why.
Yeah. No, I mean, it is interesting because I physically cannot teach something unless I fully understand it. So I spend hours looking through a tutorial sheet and trying to figure out all the different questions, all the points in this tutorial. Where are people going to get stuck? You can't. Where is it going to be the point where you suddenly say, "Oh, but why? Like, why are we talking about this assumption?" Or, why do you want me to draw a graph?
So I think we're talking about the difference between deduction and induction.
Maybe.
But let's not get too philosophical. Sarah, the thing I'll challenge with you on that is that you're setting yourself a very, very high bar. Mm-hmm. And as you teach more and more difficult concepts to more and more intelligent PhD students, there's going to come a time where you can't do that.
Yeah.
And then you have to accept, and it comes back to my concept of what you're trying to do is help the students learn. It's not about you teaching. I'm now, and I can do this, I guess, because I'm older and relatively new to the subject. I will get up in a class and teach Bayesian statistics. And I'll tell at least the MBA students, I'll say, you guys have been studying statistics. You're probably just as good. Many of you are just as good as me or better at statistics. I'm going to go through this problem. I am probably going to make mistakes. And when I do, it's your job to help us figure this out together.
I see.
And that's a very liberating way of teaching because it doesn't put the same pressure on you to be the expert. It's also very engaging for them because they now are tied in.
Mm-hmm.
And it doesn't separate you from them. You're not sort of belittling them that you're the brilliant one. And now, look, if you're Nick Chater
is brilliant, so that's fine.
Is brilliant.
Yeah.
And someone would ask Nick a question, and he'd go up, let me think about that. And he'd start writing formulas out. And then at the end, he'd go, you're right because X is less than Y. Or he'd say, you're wrong because X is greater than Y. I would never, there's very few areas where I would have the confidence of going up and doing that. Now, you guys will, and I will in some areas of behavioral economics, have Rebecca McDonald had that, if you remember, Merle. She had that confidence too because she's very, very good.
She was an excellent teacher.
But just because you can't do it doesn't mean you can't all figure it out together.
True.
And now you're putting some responsibility on the students, which must be a good thing. It's appealing to the kind of Merles who aren't just there to Merle will go, oh, I have to help the teacher figure this one out.
True.
Then she can go home and
True.
Not have to do as much reading because she thought in the classroom.
Yeah. No, I'm definitely going to take that on board and actually implement that. That's a really good idea.
I think it's just really interesting, Bruce, because you've mentioned how you were taught yourself. I mean, you were effectively taught by Nobel Prize winners, so fair enough. But they were stand in front of the class with their chalk, nice and old school, actually proven to probably be the most efficient way as well as compared to a whiteboard and an e-board and God knows whatever type of board. And go through these formulas, and you'd sit there and you'd copy it from them, and they are the expert, you are the junior, and just get through it. Whereas this is not at all how you teach yourself. And I find it fascinating that you just completely flipped it around, where you had teachers who were complete experts, whether they were objectively or just in your eyes and that of your peers. And now you're yourself like, I'm not an expert in this, just let's figure this out together.
Well, I'm trying.
Yeah.
I still do a lot of exactly what they did. I put up a slide that say, here's the marginal utility graph, and here are the 4 axioms that it's based on, and you have to learn them. And the first one means that apples are greater than oranges. Well, actually, even that, I will use I can promise you, Eugene Fama never used fruit to explain the axioms of the marginal utility curve.
Oh.
And it's easier for people to understand choices in that kind of way. So I guess I do some of that.
Fair enough.
But I think there's also just not the same respect for expertise, right? We walked in and Professor Fama, and we said, he said, not quite, but he would almost say, good morning, class. And we'd say, good morning, Professor Fama. And we were in our 20s. We walked into Warwick. We called Graham. We called Nick. So there's
that is true.
And just because Graham said something didn't mean that we were going to believe it, right? There's a healthy skepticism about any experts, which I think in my era there was a lot more. You sat down and you listened, and they knew and you didn't. And I'm not sure. Fama would put people down. He'd say, well, that's a stupid question. Next question.
Okay.
And at the time, we thought that was in the schoolboy sort of classroom, we thought that was quite funny and laughed at the person who was ridiculed.
No.
But that can really hurt people.
Yeah, that is not something I'm going to be pulling anytime soon. Absolutely not.
Yeah.
No. Yeah. That's just bullying.
Yeah, it's just bullying. Nowadays that's bullying, and then it was teaching. It's very interesting. So, Bruce, as a last, almost summarizing question, I suppose, for someone who's now getting into teaching, specifically teaching behavioral economics, what advice would you give?
Oh, I think show your passion. I love behavioral economics. I find it very easy to teach. I teach the stuff that I'm most interested in, regardless of what the curriculum says. You'll get through most of the curriculum. Usually, if they're not having exams and writing papers, they don't need to learn all of it. They need to learn enough. And the best teachers are the passionate ones. you need to be engaged, and you have to over-teach as a result. I find this very difficult. But even on this call, I might think I'm sounding enthusiastic, but I'm not sounding as enthusiastic as I think I'm sounding,
I see.
if you know what I mean. So the teachers who come in and speaks more slowly, who use the arm movements and are really passionate and overly enthusiastic, what they feel is over-enthusiasm, helps the students. Do it, what you're really interested in, and do it with passion.
That's some great advice.
And then hope the students actually get it. Just hope that you're not so so passionate that you're going, at the speed of a freight train and there's no stopping.
Well, that could be a challenge.
Thank you so much, Bruce, for taking the time to speak to us today. It's been fantastic.
Thank you. It's a great talking to both of you.
Thank you.
I mean, this is your moment to plug yourself and your social media and your LinkedIn or anything you'd like to plug if the listener wants to, keep up to date with your doings, your comings and goings.
See, I'm not doing nearly enough in social media and LinkedIn, but I am on LinkedIn, and I'd love to hear anybody's ideas, and love to keep on the conversation with you and your listeners.
So that was us talking to the amazing Bruce, very close friend of mine, so I'm always happy to have him on the show or to have any of my friends on the show. But I think it was a really interesting conversation with regards to teaching. And, I'm quite impressed with how Bruce teaches, how he tries to engage. Sarah, what do you think?
I thought it was, this whole topic is really interesting to me, partly because I do a bit of teaching myself. So I'm talking about it, sort of, figuring out what my opinion is on what makes a good teacher. And also it's great to rack the brain of someone who is considered a very good teacher in all regards. I mean, the job description that Bruce holds sort of backs him up with this. So, no, really interesting. I love the fact that I felt like I was a bit like a fly on the wall while you guys were reminiscing about your college experience of it. But
sorry,
it was great. You guys were name dropping everyone, and I was like, oh god, I feel a bit like left out. I'm like the new kid, but
oh, I'm sorry, really mate. That was never my intention. No, it's just, Bruce and I, we it was really funny when we started the masters. Quick tangent. He was the oldest and I was the youngest, and he literally has my dad's age. So we got on really, really well, which is just really funny in hindsight. But yeah, no, I'm actually really happy that Bruce moved into teaching after he finished the masters, because like I said, he's a really nice guy to hang out with. But I do think he fits the role well, and given that I've been in some of his now obviously online lectures for the sake of COVID, I think he's a great teacher. So I think he fits his own criteria, which is nice. Do you think you're a good teacher? Do you?
I like to think that I'm a good teacher, obviously. I think probably everyone likes to think that they're good at stuff. But, I'm still learning. It was really interesting, actually, in our conversation to realize, how different my approach is to teaching than maybe yours or Bruce's is. And partly that could be driven by the fact that I think I'm a different type of learner than you.
Oh, totally.
More stubborn and pedantic, but also I have this weird need to know the mechanism in order to figure out why I should care about it and also where to store it in my memory bank.
Sure. No, I get that. I get that. I think that's actually probably the main reason that we're such different teachers. Do I think I'm a good teacher? It really depends on what I teach. I've once had to teach a first year's undergrad marketing course where the students they didn't want to be there. And that is just, in such an environment, it is quite hell to teach, because they don't do the work, they hardly show up. And then, especially because I wasn't teaching the lectures, I was teaching the seminars. And then if every single time they show up and they haven't done the work, it means that you are rehashing the work rather than teaching a seminar. So after a while, the lecturer, so the course coordinator, was very much aware of this. So was I a good teacher in that course? No, I was a very annoyed teacher in that course. But I also helped teach coding, so coding in R, and I also helped teach neuroeconomics with Elliot, who we continuously name dropped throughout the talk with Bruce, and that was great. So I think by that stage I was probably a much better teacher.
No, I think you're absolutely right that, Bruce touched on this as well, that you have to bring your own passion for the subject. You can be a good teacher, but you're going to be a better teacher at things that you are passionate about and that you genuinely love in terms of subjects. But, it's interesting what you were saying about, students that don't do the work. To me, that's almost like a challenge of being like, okay, these guys are really not interested. How do I make this interesting? Or how do I make this topic, try and convince them that this is relevant? That would be sort of the way that my brain works. And I think this sort of touches on a little bit of what Bruce was saying about how teaching in universities has changed from sort of when he was a student to now. And sort of the assumption, I think, from what he was saying way back when, not way back when, Bruce, I'm sorry, but back when Bruce was a student, was that the onus is really on the student to learn. It's the student's responsibility, to get whatever they get out of the lecture, whether it's sitting there and listening for an hour or 2 hours being talked at. It's up to the student to do with that material and translate that into learning. Whereas now I think the assumption is that the teacher actually has a responsibility to make the material accessible and engaging and interesting. And it's not that it's completely the teacher's responsibility. Obviously, we are in a different environment than if we're in sort of secondary school and primary school. But I think it's a more collaborative approach that's generally considered the best today. I don't know. What do you make of that?
I mean, do I think you're right? Yes. Do I think it makes somewhat sense from a pedagogical viewpoint? Maybe. Do I like it myself? No, I think it's bullshit. And then this is the thing. Like, my teaching style is on the way I was taught myself, is old school. Like, I just got talked at, and like I mentioned before, like, I'm not good at being talked at, which is exactly why I'm doing a podcast. But I was stuck in those lectures, and I think most lectures within my undergrad, within the masters I didn't really show up to lectures, and that's no disrespect to the teacher, but it's just you're talking against the wall. Like, I am not the sponge. I am maybe a sponge when I read, but not a sponge when I listen. So there's no point for me to do it. I've actually sat in lectures where I'm literally reading the same material with earplugs in. Which no one has actually ever, called me out on. So I guess I'm quite, subtle when I do this. But no, I still think, because I just very vividly remember this marketing class. If there's kids in there, quote unquote kids, if there's kids in there that don't want to learn, and that are, because, if you're doing a master, if you're doing any type of education at the Warwick Business School, it's fucking expensive. It really is, even for British standards. So if you're sitting there and you or your parents or the government is paying thousands and thousands of pounds for you to learn something, and you're just there like, yeah, I'm really not bothered. Like, I don't feel like I should put in the work. In that case, I'm also not putting in the work into you. If I've got, quote unquote, kids sitting there that are, eager, yet just, really just don't get it, or their English isn't that great, or they've switched to a subject matter where they've had absolutely no prior experience, then I'll be a good teacher. Then I'll help and then I'll support. But if you're there wasting my time, I'm not wasting my time on you. And that's, I don't know, apparently in nowadays teaching, that sounds really harsh, but like, by this stage, if you're teaching at university, these aren't, like, I keep calling them kids. These are adults. I am also an adult. Both of us aren't actually that different in age from the people that we teach.
No, that's weird, isn't it?
Yeah, so it's not, it's sometimes it's weird, but you can give an air of expertise and age through experience, I suppose. But it's just, if you don't want to be there, you don't have to be there. Like, you don't have to be there for my sake. Don't waste my time. And with regards to that, I think I'm quite a harsh teacher.
I know, it's interesting to hear that in some regards you were the student that you hate teaching. Does that make sense?
No, I wasn't. I really wasn't, because I put in the work as a student. I was like, I have actually told some of my lecturers, listen, I am not the type of person that does well in a lecture. I'm never gonna show up, because one of the lecturers had like, it was mandatory to show up. You had to sign off on it. And then the teacher was like, then what are you gonna do? I'm like, I'm gonna sit in the corner and read through the book and like read through the material that you're actually discussing. And he was like, are you sure? I'm like, isn't the lecture easy? I'm like, no, it's not. I can't do anything with this. And then as soon as at the beginning, at the end of every lecture, I just stuck my head in. And he's like, what have you done? I'm like, I've read chapter 5 and 6. He's like, okay. And he signed me off. And that actually did work. I mean, if you want to learn, teachers really aren't bad people. If you don't want to learn, they can get terrible. It is what it is.
Yeah.
That's the behavioral science of teaching kids.
No, I think you're right. Well, it's definitely easier to teach people who are engaged and actually want to be there. And also it's sort of like this reciprocal relationship, right? Where if students sort of bring a little bit into the session, then you can give some extra material back. And that's sort of what we teach the students. We sort of say, here are all the resources available to you. It's up to you to access them. For example, office hours, and doing extra reading, right? We sort of make it available and we say, look, the onus is on you. If you want to access them, then you can potentially get some more out of your time at university.
So that was it for today. Again, thank you so much, Bruce, for joining us. I really, really enjoyed talking to you. I hope Sarah also enjoyed talking to you, despite, kind of being left out. Again, I'm so sorry, girl.
No, it's okay. Don't worry about my fragility. I'm fine.
Okay, that's good to know. You're much more robust than I thought. So that was it for this week. We hope you learned something cool today, or at least enjoyed a good conversation of two friends catching up. And the other third wheeling. We hope to see you again next week, and let us know if you are a teacher, if you are being taught. Let us know on the socials how that is going for you and what type of learner you are. If you're more like Sarah, that you have to understand the deep mechanisms that you just go 10 levels too deep, or whether you're more like me and you haven't shown up to a single lecture for the past 5 years and that's working for you. Yeah, just let us know, and we hope you have a good week.
You're the dummy that don't believe in science. All your projects always be denying. You're the one I love. You're